The hour you used to fall asleep has drifted later with each decade. Sleep that arrived in minutes at 30 now takes 40 at 60. You remember the version that required nothing from you, the body cooling itself without instruction, the drowsiness arriving on schedule, the transition from wakefulness to unconsciousness happening so quickly you rarely noticed it. That version disappeared somewhere in your 50s. What replaced it is a body that lies in the dark, tired but awake, the mind cycling through a day it already finished, the temperature not quite dropping, the heart rate not quite slowing, the nervous system running the chemistry of midday alertness into the hours it should have surrendered to. Repair. Every transition that once delivered you into restorative sleep has weakened. Melatonin rises against artificial light that holds it below the tipping point. Core temperature drops more slowly through vessels that dilate less readily. A vagal signal that should shift the entire system from alert to repair travels through a nerve that has lost a third of its capacity and a passage that decades of forward posture have narrowed. Sleep arrives at a body that never fully completed the handover from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. And the difference between sleep that repairs and sleep that merely passes time has nothing to do with duration. You could sleep 9 hours in this state and wake heavier than the night that gave you 6. What separates the two is whether the body completed a specific set of transitions before it closed its eyes. 6 inputs, 6 transitions, each one addressing a system that declined after 50, each one preparing a different transition in the overnight repair window. The morning discussion described 6 inputs that compensate for what time took from the waking hours. These 6 prepare the overnight window those morning inputs depend on. The overnight repair checkpoints each require a body that successfully completed the autonomic transition before sleep began. The 2 hours before bed is where the transition either happens or fails. So what happens when the first gate stays closed? It begins with timing. Specifically, when the last food crosses your lips relative to the hour your head touches the pillow. You know the heaviness. Dinner at 9 in the evening, bed at 10:30, and sleep that follows feels shallow, interrupted, thick. A sluggishness the next morning that belongs to 4 hours of rest, not 7. Blood sugar that should have cleared before the body entered its overnight fasting window is still circulating, and the consequences of that circulation during sleep are more specific than the vague heaviness suggests. Underneath the heaviness, the liver is operating on a clock that has nothing to do with your intentions. Hepatic clock genes issue enzymatic shutdown instructions as evening approaches. Fructokinase activity declines. Glycogen synthesis pathways downregulate. The directional logic of the entire organ shifts from distribution to maintenance. By 8 in the evening, the liver is running at a fraction of its midday capacity. Food that would have been sorted, distributed, and burned at noon produces a higher glucose peak, a longer excursion, and more de novo lipogenesis, the liver's fat manufacturing pathway, an hour later. Identical meal, different metabolic outcomes, separated by nothing but the hour. Think of a warehouse that opens at 6 in the morning with a full complement of staff, every conveyor belt running, every sorting station manned. Morning deliveries are processed within minutes, dispatched to their destinations, burned as fuel by midday. By early afternoon, the facility is still running near peak capacity. By early evening, half the staff has gone home and the conveyor belts are slowing. A delivery arriving after the shift change does not get processed efficiently. It sits on the loading dock, partially sorted, and by morning the overnight crew has done the only thing it could with the excess, shove it into long-term storage. Inside the liver, that storage is intrahepatic fat, visible on ultrasound, measurable on blood tests, and diagnosed clinically as steatotic liver disease. The clock does not negotiate. Hepatic enzyme capacity declines further with age, which is where the timing problem compounds after 50. A 35-year-old who finishes a late dinner has approximately 2 hours of residual enzymatic capacity between the meal and the shutdown floor. A 60-year-old finishing that late dinner may have 45 minutes because the circadian drop is steeper, the decline begins earlier, and the nadir arrives sooner. The buffer between processed in time and still circulating at midnight narrows with each decade. A dinner that cleared by 10 at 40 may still be elevating glucose at midnight at 60 because the enzymatic runway shortened while the meal schedule stayed fixed. Peripheral clock genes governing hepatic enzyme expression lose amplitude with age, as Markeva and colleagues discovered in Nature, the way a dimmer switch that once moved from full brightness to full dark begins operating in a narrower range. And then, the overnight consequence, glucose that remains elevated at sleep onset enters a mismatch window the body cannot resolve until morning. Body temperature drops during sleep. Enzymatic defenses slow with the temperature. Because enzymatic reaction rates are temperature dependent, every degree of cooling reduces enzymatic clearance proportionally. But the glucose substrate stays high. The Maillard reaction, the non-enzymatic bonding of glucose to structural proteins that produces permanent crosslinks called advanced glycation end products, runs at its highest effective rate precisely during these hours. Lower enzymatic defense, sustained glucose substrate, and the crosslinks form in collagen throughout the vascular walls, in joint cartilage, in the crystalline lens. The overnight window that should be running tissue repair is simultaneously running tissue damage, fueled by the glucose from the meal that arrived after the liver locked its doors. This mismatch extends beyond the liver. Insulin resistance increases in the evening as part of the programmed metabolic shutdown. Cells reduce their sensitivity to insulin because the intended program is to stop receiving fuel and begin repair. Glucose absorption slows across every tissue. When food arrives during this programmed resistance, glucose levels rise higher after an evening meal than after the identical meal at noon, remain elevated longer, and the pancreas must secrete more insulin to achieve clearance. The beta cells work harder to manage what the morning liver would have handled effortlessly. You test your blood glucose 2 hours after a late dinner and find it at 140, a reading that would have been 110 after the same food 6 hours earlier. You are seeing the circadian insulin resistance program encountering food it was not expecting to receive. Fewer calories, later timing, worse glucose. The liver did not care about the caloric content. It cared about the hour. Every pathway responsible for fat accumulation inside the liver worsened at night, as Marjo and colleagues demonstrated at the Radcliffe Department of Medicine at Oxford. Hepatic insulin sensitivity, fat oxidation rates, de novo lipogenesis activity, all measured in the same patients during both daytime and nocturnal windows. The patients had metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease, the condition that develops when the liver accumulates fat through metabolic dysfunction rather than alcohol. The finding that changes the clinical picture, the nighttime metabolic dysfunction persisted even after patients lost weight and reduced their liver fat content. Previous clinical assumption ran in one direction. Fat builds up, function degrades, dysfunction follows. The Oxford data reversed the arrow. The timing dysfunction precedes the disease and drives it forward regardless of dietary quality. Fix the timing, and the disease pathway may never activate. Ignore the timing, and the disease progresses regardless of what the food contains. 3 hours. That is the minimum clearance window for a moderate meal to process through a liver operating at reduced evening capacity. Finish eating by 7 if bedtime is 10. The food is not changed. The organ responsible for processing it at that hour has, but the liver is the metabolic preparation. What about the signal that tells the entire body it is time to transition from day to night, and what happens when that signal is held below its tipping point by the light in your living room? Melanopsin is a photopigment embedded in a specialized population of retinal cells that serve no visual function. These cells do not contribute to seeing. They exist to detect the presence or absence of light at a specific wavelength, approximately 480 nanometers, the blue peak of the visible spectrum. When melanopsin absorbs photons at this wavelength, the cells send a signal through the retinohypothalamic tract to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master circadian clock, reporting daytime. Melatonin production, which should begin rising 2 to 3 hours before habitual bedtime, a phase called dim light melatonin onset, is suppressed for as long as melanopsin continues receiving its target wavelength. Indoor artificial lighting delivers exactly this wavelength. Modern bulbs, screens, overhead fixtures all emit significant energy at 480 nanometers. Your screen at 9 in the evening is broadcasting the precise wavelength that prevents the transition your body needs to begin. The incandescent bulb that lit your grandparents' evening emitted most of its energy as infrared heat, with comparatively little output in the blue range. The bulb that replaced it is efficient, cool, and spectrally concentrated in exactly the range melanopsin responds to. The lighting upgrade that saved electricity simultaneously delayed melatonin onset in every room it illuminated. Amber lenses block 90% or more of wavelengths below 530 nanometers, removing the melanopsin wavelength from reaching the retinal cells while preserving visual function entirely. You can still see, read, and watch television with the lenses on because the visual cortex processes through cones that operate across the full spectrum. Melanopsin receives no daytime signal. Melatonin rises on schedule. Amber lenses worn before bed improve melatonin onset, subjective sleep quality, and measurable sleep architecture, as Burkhardt and Phelps documented in Chronobiology International in 2009, and Schechter and colleagues confirmed in the Journal of Psychiatric Research in 2018, both in independent trials. Two research groups, two different protocols, convergent findings. Well, the protection matters more after 50 because the pineal gland produces less melatonin each year. Suppressing what remains with artificial blue light pushes nighttime melatonin below the crossover for clean sleep onset. After 50, the pineal's remaining output cannot absorb any further suppression. Two forces converging on the same molecule from opposite directions. Natural decline reducing production, artificial light suppressing what remains. Now, what the lenses change is immediate. The week I wore amber lenses from 8 each evening, sleep onset shortened on the first night, measurably and consistently, which is why the lenses sit beside my reading chair permanently. The intervention requires no discipline beyond putting them on. The evening stays exactly as it was. The only change is which wavelengths reach the photopigment that governs the master clock. So the metabolic preparation is timed and the circadian signal is protected. Can the body reach sleep onset on those two inputs alone? It cannot. Sleep onset requires a decline in core body temperature of approximately 1 degree Celsius, and the body achieves this through peripheral vasodilation. Blood flows to the skin surface of the hands, the feet, the face. Heat radiates outward to the skin. Core temperature drops. A warm shower 90 minutes before bed forces the vasodilation step. Warm water at 40 to 42 degrees Celsius on the skin dilates peripheral blood vessels maximally, opening the body's full 1.7 square meters of skin surface as a heat exchange radiator. After the shower ends, the dilated vessels continue radiating heat into cooler room air. Warm blood from the core flows outward to the flushed skin, dumps its heat through radiation and convection, and returns cooled through the venous system. Core temperature drops faster and further than it would without the thermal assist. Heating the body makes it cool faster because the heating pre-dilates the radiators. Without the shower, the circadian cooling process is slow, the vasodilation gradual, the temperature decline taking 2 to 3 hours through natural circadian mechanisms alone. With the shower, the radiators are already fully open. Core heat dumps at a rate that far exceeds the natural decline. The reddening you see in your hands and face after the shower is the vasodilation made visible, the warm blood flowing outward through vessels that will continue radiating heat for the next 60 to 90 minutes. The cooling that follows is the sleep mechanism. The warmth was the tool. Warm water bathing 1 to 2 hours before bed improved both sleep onset latency and overall sleep quality across a meta-analysis of 17 studies, as Haige and colleagues established in Sleep Medicine Reviews in 2019. Optimal window, 90 minutes before intended sleep onset, enough time for the post-shower heat dissipation to produce the core temperature nadir that coincides with the moment the head touches the pillow. Vessels that cooled the body efficiently at 40 dilate more sluggishly at 60. Peripheral vasodilation is blunted after 50. Heat dissipation slower, the core temperature drops smaller and later. The warm shower provides the thermal forcing function the body's own thermoregulation delivers less effectively with each decade. That drowsiness you feel in the 30 minutes after a warm shower is core temperature declining past the preoptic threshold, the hypothalamus detecting the drop and initiating the sleep cascade through neurochemical inhibition of the brainstem arousal centers. The younger body produced this trajectory automatically through its own circadian vasodilation. The older body needs the assist. The circadian amplitude that once moved core temperature from daytime peak to nighttime nadir in a clean arc has flattened, the evening decline shallower, the tipping point harder to reach without the vascular boost the warm water delivers. 3 inputs prepare the terrain. Each one changed the environment around the body: meal timing, light wavelength, skin temperature. External conditions set for sleep. But what opens the gate the repair program sits behind? What comes next is different. 3 inputs that activate pathways the nervous system must engage before the overnight repair window can open. The gate is autonomic, the key is vagal, and the vagus nerve that must turn that key has been compressed, underactivated, and declining in capacity for decades. Passage first. Your vagus nerve exits the skull through the jugular foramen, a bony canal at the base of the cranium shared with two other cranial nerves and the internal jugular vein, approximately 12 millimeters in its longest diameter. It does not widen. It cannot expand to accommodate swelling in the surrounding tissue. And surrounding it, the suboccipital muscles, four paired muscles connecting the skull base to the first two cervical vertebrae, have been locked in sustained isometric contraction for the full duration of your screen-lit, downward-gazing day. 12 to 27 kilograms of effective load depending on the degree of forward head displacement, compressing the passage and every structure inside it for hours without release. The muscles are small, designed for precision adjustment of head position, and the sustained load converts them from instruments of fine rotational control into structural beams locked against gravity for the full waking day. Tennis ball peanut positioned at the suboccipital ridge, the gap between the two balls straddling the spine. 60 to 90 seconds of sustained pressure. The suboccipital muscles that carried the day's load release through ischemic compression, followed by reactive vasodilation, blood rushing back into tissue that has been oxygen deprived since your last position change. Warmth spreading across the base of the skull is the return of circulation to tissue that was functionally ischemic. The sensation is specific, a softening that starts deep at the skull base and radiates outward as the locked fibers release in sequence, and underneath the muscular release, a change you did not initiate. The breath deepens without conscious effort. The exhale lengthens. Heart rate drops. The vagal brake that was mechanically weakened by the compression strengthens as the compression lifts. The jugular foramen passage widens. Muscle volume decreases. The vagus nerve travels through with less compression. The signal arrives at the brainstem at closer to full strength. Decades of forward posture have produced structural fascial remodeling at this site. The compression is years of collagen laid down along the lines of habitual stress, cross-linked further by glycation products with each passing decade. Daily release prevents further adhesion, maintains the passage width the nerve requires, and restores signal capacity that accumulated compression was degrading. Anyone with cervical spine pathology should consult a physician before applying sustained pressure at the skull base. For the majority who carry the standard postural load of modern screen life, the evening release is the daily maintenance before asking the nerve to initiate the autonomic shift. Sleep depends on, but can the nerve deliver the signal if the airway bypasses the factory that supplies the lungs with their overnight vasodilatory molecule? Tongue pressed to the hard palate. Saline rinse if nasal congestion is present. The genioglossus, the largest extrinsic tongue muscle, maintains palatal contact during waking hours through habitual use, pressing the tongue body against the roof of the mouth during swallowing, during speech, during the resting intervals between these activities. During sleep, muscle tone decreases globally. The genioglossus loses approximately 40% of its waking tone during non-REM sleep. If the waking tone was strong enough that a 40% reduction still maintains the palatal seal, the tongue stays up, the jaw stays closed, the air routes through the nose, and each of the 5,760 breaths across a full sleep period collects concentrated nitric oxide from the paranasal sinuses and delivers it to the pulmonary capillary beds, sustaining vasodilation, preserving the nocturnal blood pressure dip, maintaining the cardiovascular recovery window. If the waking tone was marginal, the seal breaks, the jaw opens, the tongue falls posteriorly toward the pharyngeal wall, and the overnight consequence runs in full. Nasal nitric oxide bypassed across every breath, pulmonary vasodilation absent, nocturnal dip eliminated, the right ventricle working against narrow vessels through the hours it was supposed to rest. 20 years of mouth breathing is 7,300 nights of missed delivery. 42 million breaths that bypass the factory. The dry mouth at 6 in the morning is the accessible signal for the inaccessible measurement. If the mouth is dry, the air bypassed the factory. If the air bypassed the factory, the pulmonary vasodilation was reduced. If the vasodilation was reduced, the nocturnal dip was compromised. The genioglossus relaxes more deeply during slow-wave sleep, as sarcopenia weakens it with each decade. And the nasal passage narrows alongside it as mucosal tissue thickens, and the nasal valve loses cartilaginous support. Two prerequisites for nocturnal mouth breathing converging at precisely the age when the cardiovascular consequences of a lost nocturnal dip are most dangerous. The tongue can be retrained and the nasal passage can be cleared, but both require consistent evening practice. The convergence is the default trajectory for every adult who does not actively intervene. Evening tongue-to-palate practice builds the genioglossus tone that must hold against the deeper muscular relaxation the aging body experiences overnight. The daytime habit is the muscular prerequisite for the nocturnal seal that determines which airway the body uses for the full sleep period, and which version of the cardiovascular recovery window the heart receives, and then the final input, the one that determines whether the autonomic transition completes. You know the gap. Body in bed, room dark, temperature dropped, passage cleared, airway sealed, every condition for sleep met, and the mind is still cycling. Heart rate has not descended. The nervous system is running alert chemistry into the first hour of what should be deep repair. That gap between lying down and actually transitioning to sleep widens with every decade, and the widening is autonomic. The nerve that should be pulling the system past the parasympathetic boundary lacks the resting output to do it alone. Respiratory sinus arrhythmia is the mechanism that crosses it. During every breath you take, your heart rate oscillates. It accelerates slightly during inhalation as the vagal brake releases and decelerates during exhalation as the brake re-engages. This oscillation is a vagally mediated reflex, one of the oldest autonomic rhythms in vertebrate physiology, present in every mammalian heart. You cannot feel the oscillation under normal conditions. The fluctuation is too small, a few beats per minute in either direction, but a heart rate monitor captures it precisely. The line rising and falling with each breath like a tide governed by the lungs. The amplitude of that oscillation is itself a measurement of vagal health because the nerve must be strong enough to produce the deceleration on each exhale and release it on each inhale. The balance between the two phases determines which branch of the autonomic nervous system dominates at any given moment. During rapid, shallow breathing, the inhale and exhale phases are roughly equal, the autonomic balance unchanged. During slow breathing with an extended exhale, the balance tips, extending the exhale tilts that balance. 4 seconds inhaling, 6 to 8 seconds exhaling. Each elongated exhale holds the vagal brake engaged for a longer duration than the inhale releases it. Across 10 breath cycles, the cumulative parasympathetic input exceeds the sympathetic input by a measurable margin. Heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat variation that reflects vagal tone in real time, increases with each cycle. Autonomic balance shifts toward the parasympathetic dominance that sleep onset requires. The vagal afferents carry each exhale's mechanical signal to the nucleus tractus solitarius in the brainstem, the primary integration center for autonomic input, and the brainstem adjusts cardiac output downward with each cycle. The adjustment is cumulative. Each breath deposits a small parasympathetic increment, and the increments compound across the breathing interval until the autonomic balance crosses the line the body has been hovering above. 5 minutes of cyclic sighing, a variant of extended exhale breathing that uses a double inhale through the nose, followed by a prolonged exhale through the mouth, outperformed mindfulness meditation for both stress reduction and autonomic balance, as Balban and colleagues reported at Stanford in 2023. The mechanism is dual. The double inhale reinflates collapsed alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs that partially deflate during shallow breathing, maximizing gas exchange surface. The extended exhale drives vagal activation through the respiratory sinus arrhythmia pathway, both operating in one breathing pattern. An equivalent duration of sitting quietly with eyes closed did not produce the same autonomic shift. Why this matters more after 50 than at any earlier decade. By 65, the parasympathetic baseline has lost roughly 35% of its peak capacity, approximately 1% per year since 30. The autonomic shift once happened spontaneously because the nerve's resting output was high enough that the natural evening decline in sympathetic activity, combined with the circadian melatonin rise and the core temperature drop, pushed the system past the threshold without deliberate effort. The transition required no effort because the nerve had capacity to spare, a margin wide enough that the natural circadian signals alone carried the body across. At 60, the nerve does not have capacity to spare. Resting vagal output sits closer to the line. Melatonin rises, temperature drops, conditions align, and the autonomic state hovers just above the boundary, unable to cross without a deliberate activation signal. This is the gap you feel. The extended exhale provides the signal. The breathing protocol drives vagal output above the crossover. The diminished nerve can no longer reach on its own. The signal is mechanical, delivered through the oldest autonomic reflex the body possesses, requiring no cognitive effort beyond counting the breath. Well, the evening I monitored my own heart rate variability during the protocol, the shift was visible in real time. A standard vagal tone measurement climbed from 26 milliseconds before the breathing began to 41 milliseconds by the end of the 5th minute. 15 milliseconds of increased vagal output from nothing more than adjusting the ratio between inhale and exhale. Heart rate dropped 5 beats per minute. Breathing slowed further on its own after the deliberate pacing ended, the body settling into the parasympathetic state the extended exhale had initiated. The transition I had been waiting for, the one that used to happen without instruction, had been delivered through a respiratory input the aging nerve required. Every checkpoint in the overnight repair sequence sits behind the parasympathetic shift. The checkpoints the night repair discussion described: growth hormone, glymphatic clearance, immune reconstitution, each requires parasympathetic dominance to initiate. Growth hormone pulses during the first bout of slow-wave sleep. Without the shift, slow-wave sleep is delayed or truncated, and the growth hormone pulse fires at reduced amplitude or misses its window entirely. Glymphatic clearance, the fluid system that flushes metabolic waste from the brain through channels that open only during deep sleep, operates behind the parasympathetic shift. Immune reconstitution peaks during the parasympathetic hours, natural killer cells resuming the surveillance that sympathetic dominance suppressed during the day. The extended exhale is the input that opens the gate those checkpoints sit behind, open or closed, nothing in between. You go from the couch to the bed with no evening preparation, and the repair program runs at a fraction. You deliver the 6 inputs in the final 2 hours, and the full program engages. The difference between the two compounds across years into the difference between a body that maintains itself overnight and a body that falls incrementally behind with each incomplete repair cycle. Every morning that follows an unprepared evening carries the deficit forward. The transitions that once required nothing from you now require all 6. The gate that once opened without instruction now requires every one. The physics has not changed. The margin has.